Well, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my gratitude for your interest here today, for your readiness to be here and to listen to what I have to say. Actually, I'm here for the very first time as the acting chairperson-in-office of the OSCE. Most of you know the Vienna Hofburg, and once one walks the corridors of this building, which is quite far flung and rambling, sometimes confusing, one gets to know the spirit of the OSCE. I had been looking forward actually to assuming the chairmanship of the OSCE. That delight at assuming the chairmanship has though been somewhat tempered by the cruel terrorist attack of Istanbul. The shock is really deep-seated. The news are slowly sinking in, and sadness begins to permeate everything. Right now we don't have any clarity about the background of this murderous crime. What is clear, however, is that the murderers are aiming at changing our lives. They want us to be afraid. They want us to be so scared as not to leave the houses and not to go outside, be that in Istanbul, Paris or Jakarta. Istanbul has been a clear illustration of the fact that terror constitutes a threat everywhere, be that the Middle East, be that Turkey, be it Europe or elsewhere. These are difficult times indeed, and thus the German government has been aware of what was lying in wait for it when it expressed its readiness to assume the presidency of the chairmanship of the OSCE. We are recognizing the responsibility that we bear. We are putting our full engagement into this task, and we are fully committed to doing our best. We are convinced that the OSCE, especially in critical times, serves as a forum for dialogue and confidence building and is indispensable in that capacity. As I said in my introductory remarks today to the ambassadors at the OSCE, appears to me to be the right place for this, because it stretches from Vancouver to Vladivostok and thus brings together exactly those players required to tackle the pressing issues of our times. When I look back to the public debate of the last few weeks about the OSCE, and if I interpret it correctly, this seems to be a recognition that seems to be increasingly shared by a greater number of people. Despite the shortcomings and the weaknesses of the OSCE, people increasingly recognize its potential in these days that are anything but easy. And I think that the majority, as we were able to realize when we listened to our counterparts earlier today, acknowledge its potential. As concerns the process of deliberation and discussion within the OSCE, it's been dominated for almost 2 years by the conflict in Ukraine. Today, the Ukrainian foreign minister was here, and thus we also talked about the conflict in Ukraine. Over the last 2 years, the OSCE has proved to be a central instrument with regard to implementing the Minsk agreements, and I, for one, am convinced that the existing mandate of the Special Monitoring Mission will also continue to serve as a good framework for future tasks, and I very much hope that we will be able to take speedy decisions on that soon. I am equally delighted that at yesterday's meeting of the conflict parties within the contact group did not only have a discussion of the status quo, a kind of stock taking, but have also been able to agree on a quite extensive exchange of prisoners. Also, it has been possible to reach a rapprochement on the topic of the clearing of mines. That is also a contribution to building trust with regard to the conflict in Ukraine. However, we should not only cherish hopes, but we should also do whatever we can, putting to good use the means we have. Working with our French friends in the Normandy format was to make sure that the rapprochement that has been brought about can also be carried into the political working group, which has the task to prepare the legal ground for a law governing local elections in eastern Ukraine, so as to create legitimacy as a consequence of legal elections. That kind of rapprochement is what we are hoping to also bring about in the political working group. Anything but easy, I grant you that. But as I said, we will put all our effort into this, and we will work very hard. We will focus on it here in the work of the OSCE, but also as regards the talks that the foreign ministers have at the level of the Normandy format in the coming weeks. If you had had the opportunity to listen to the contributions by the ambassadors of the OSCE member states earlier, you would have been aware, you would have been able to realize that, of course, the Ukraine conflict is not the only topic that the OSCE has to deal with and about which representatives have expressed their concern. We still have the protracted conflicts of the past that tend or have the risk of flaring up, and that also carry the risk of taking a violent turn. Transnistria and Nagorno-Karabakh being but two cases in point, Southern Caucasus being another case in point. We listened to many of the ambassadors of the countries concerned and the neighboring countries of these countries in the conflict region, that they have expectations of the German chairmanship, that we engage in intensifying in a very obvious manner the dialogue between the conflict parties, and I made myself very clear saying that we intend to do so. A final word, ladies and gentlemen, the terrorist attack of Istanbul has once again brought it home to us that this year too, in 2016, we will have to dedicate much of our attention and work to the security threats and challenges, mainly focusing on combating terrorism. And I met with great support and agreement on the part of the ambassadors here when I suggested that we begin about preparing a major conference on terrorism, which we intend to organize in Berlin in the course of this year, which will be dedicated to the question of how can we prevent tendencies of radicalization taking hold of the minds and the hearts of especially young people. Amongst others, we will also have to address the question, and I believe the OSCE, because it brings together so many countries, is the right place for that, is to address the question of how we intend to deal with jihadists who return to their home countries after having participated in combat, returning to our countries, to the member states of the OSCE. These questions are anything but easy, but hopefully we will be able to find shared common answers. I've just been trying to sort of, give you a brief outline of what is lying in store. We are quite aware of this task not being anything but easy. 2015 and 14 weren't easy years either, when Switzerland and Serbia took the lead, especially at times where it's fair to say the Ukraine conflict exploded into our faces. We will give our full commitment to tackling and addressing this task. And earlier on, I called upon my colleagues to not just, be satisfied with or leave it at making appeals to the chairmanship to seek consensus. I was very clear. I believe the OSCE is an organization that works on the basis of consensus. But if we want to bring about consensus, we also need the readiness to enter into a compromise. And that is what all the member states have to put into it. And I am confident that that will be granted. Thank you very much.
I will again ask you to speak clearly into the microphone simply for the benefit of the live stream. Thank you. Klaus?
Klaus Prempers, Deutsche Welle.
Klaus Prempers, Deutsche Welle. Two questions, Mr. Minister. You hinted at the fact that the issue of refugees will also be tackled by the OSCE. A conference in autumn this year. Isn't there anything else the OSCE can do? Well, what about the implementation day, as we happen to have you here today? We have been in close touch with Iran in the course of the last few days. You may be aware of the fact that I paid a visit to Tehran only a few weeks ago, at the time where the agenda was very much dominated, not really by the latest or the newly arisen tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but at a time where we were still busy dealing with the question of agreeing on a final document, which we then signed here in Vienna in July, and seeing that that is actually implemented. And after my visit to Tehran, I really returned under the impression that they are working hard and seriously to achieve an implementation at the earliest possible date. These days we are waiting for the respective opinion by the International Atomic Agency, IAEO. You may be aware of the fact that decisive steps have been taken relatively speedily. The enriched uranium has been taken outside the country. Now, the details, of course, will be assessed now, and legal opinion will be drawn up by the IAEA. I very much hope that this will lead to a positive assessment, and then it should be possible to actually have that implementation day within a very short period. Now, as concerns the issue of the refugees, you know that at home in Germany, that is, we have made our contribution. We've brought on the way 2 asylum packages. We're now busy at the European level, seeking and working hard to get the support of our partners for measures that can only be taken at the European level. Progress has been achieved here indeed. For example, in the area of expanding the Frontex operation, there is not only readiness, but also decisions have been taken on the part of the member states of the European Union to strengthen the mandate. But I want to be quite frank, we are not quite where I would wish us to be. We're not quite there as far as the European Union is concerned. And this is why we will have to make sure in the coming days, and I say days because we're going to meet again in Brussels next week at the level of the foreign ministers, thus we will have to make sure that what is still lacking, what still has to be attended to, that is the so-called hotspots, the reception centers, then are being set up in the Mediterranean member states. I'm thinking particularly of Italy and Greece here, and that this is being done as quickly as possible. You may remember that certain commitments had already been made at the last but one European summit meeting on the part of Greece, and we will continue to try to impress our partners in the European Union of the need that there has to be a more just distribution of the responsibility amongst the member states of the European Union when it comes to taking in refugees.
Löwenstein, FAZ.
FAZ, Herr Löwenstein. Minister, as concerns the topic of Ukraine, some have it that it would have and could have a positive effect on the efforts of the OSCE, that a country with the political weight of Germany, which is and happens to be a partner of the OSCE format and has the chair of the OSCE, could make a greater contribution. Do you share that assessment, and in what way could it have a positive effect? And if so, in what way do you intend to bring your weight to bear to the benefit of the OSCE? Well, perhaps I could answer that question at the end of this year, but anyway, it will be put to me at the end of the year. Thus, for the time being, I cannot but only try to somewhat to speculate to some extent and to try to look ahead. Of course, the chairmanship of the OSCE, being the chairperson-in-office of the OSCE, is something very important. There's no denying that fact, and as long as the Ukraine conflict continues to dominate the debates and the deliberations of the OSCE, as long as that is the case, it's going to continue to be important to have someone in the chair who is ready to engage in trying to solve this conflict. And we're doing that as members of the OSCE, and as you also rightly indicated, with the help of the Normandy format. And we're putting a lot of time into that effort. We're investing a lot of time. We have also invested a lot of expertise that we have continue to expand in our Foreign Office. We meet and are active at all levels, at the levels of the state secretaries. We meet at short intervals at the foreign ministers' level, as you might be aware. Thus, I think that the fact that Germany has the chairmanship is of importance, but what is going to be decisive at the end of the day is that the conflict parties don't, dig their heels in, but or insist on positions that do not contribute to a compromise being found. What we need to have is, on the part of the conflict partners, the readiness and the willingness to conceive of the Minsk agreements as the foundation for the efforts to be implemented. At the last meeting, at the level of the foreign ministers, we, the Germans and the French, that is, made it clear that we will continue to have to rely on Russia using its influence on the separatists in order to make sure that weapons are being withdrawn, that it will be possible to allow the missions of the OSCE to carry out its task of verifying that actually the weapons are being withdrawn, that the separatists don't have expectations that cannot be fulfilled as regards the special status for Donbass. And in return, we need to have Ukraine stand by the commitments it entered into in helping bring about, continuing the legal road of creating the legal foundations or the legal basis for a law governing local elections. Of course, we have a national debate on this, on whether this might lead to unacceptable delays. Is there? German television ARD, Rüger. Fighting terror, combating terror is one of the objectives you defined. How do you intend to involve countries that are not members of the OSCE, for example, Syria and Iraq? And a second question, what do you have to say on the issue of the return of refugees, for example, at the border of Turkey and Syria, and then at the border between Germany and Austria? Perhaps you could comment on that just briefly. As concerns the latter question, I cannot comment on it here and now. I've only heard of it this morning. I haven't been able to verify the information on which you base your question. What is obvious, though, is that we must try and continue to fight terror by helping diffuse the causes of political conflicts in the world, participating not from afar by commenting them, but also by engaging and conceiving of ourselves as members of a group of states which have taken the first steps, amongst others here in Vienna, in order to, as far as Syria is concerned, at least agree on the rough outlines of a solution. It was only yesterday evening in Berlin, actually, that I received representatives of the political opposition in Syria. They were headed by the former Prime Minister, Hijab, who chairs the talks of the opposition in Riyadh, or headed the talks in Riyadh with the United Nations. And I must say I left that exchange of views fortified in the belief that there is the readiness to seek a solution. The question, however, is whether it will be possible to impress upon the representatives of the regime in Damascus that there is but one alternative, and that is the path that we have sketched out here in that agreed paper, where the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, France, Great Britain, and Germany, for Europe, almost all the neighboring countries of Syria were involved. It is now for the representatives of the regime on the ground to express their willingness to pursue that path with us and to begin a process of transition in Syria, we need to have a ceasefire between the security forces and also of the opposition forces of the regime, and the aim of that process being that the state can be reorganized and restructured with the objective of having a pluralist and democratic state which respects, or rather maintains, the principle of secularism that the country used to adhere to in the past. It's us aiming high. It's not going to be easy, I grant you that, and you may understand why I say that. But the talks are underway, they have begun, and in the second half of January, the special representative of the United Nations, Staffan de Mistura, will meet with representatives of the regime and with the opposition in turn in order to test the ground and see whether that is a possible way to go. And I think that that is going to constitute the decisive contribution to fight the spread of the so-called IS, and that's the spread of terror, whilst at the same time finding a response, an answer to the issue of migration. We will have to talk in great detail and in great length about the impact of migration. Much is being discussed as far as that is concerned in Germany and in Europe, but I think we will only make decisive headway here if we tackle the root causes, and those are, or amongst them are, violence and persecution in the Middle East. Only then can we make great progress if we tackle these issues.
Andreas Mitschitz, Österreichischer Rundfunk. Herr Außenminister, ich möchte da nachhaken, habe ich Sie jetzt richtig verstanden? Es ist aus Ihrer Sicht noch nicht sicher, dass wie geplant am 25. Jänner die Gespräche zwischen dem syrischen Regime und der Opposition in Genf beginnen können, so wie das im November in Wien eigentlich vereinbart worden ist?
So ist unsere Planung und so ist der Zeitplan der Vereinten Nationen. Aber
plan of the United Nations, but of course there are people on both sides, and conditions therefore need to be agreed with representatives of the regimes. We cannot have representation of just one side, we need both, which is why that in the wake of conversations yesterday, I am not less confident that we will abide by our time scale. We all know that in such a particularly sensitive area, there may be changes.
Augenblick ist das nicht sichtbar und nicht der Fall.
For the time being, this is not visible.
Dass wir 20.
No. Can I? At the latest, going to meet in that constellation.
So, vielen Dank.
Bitte, dass dann